good to see a nice full house here. My name is Jonathan Hagel. I teach history here at KU, and it'll be my pleasure to moderate this morning's discussion with Rick Perlstein. I imagine most of you were at last night's talk, so I will spare you my version of the full Monty introduction, as our colleague, as my colleague David Farber called it last night. Just to say that, to my mind, Rick Perlstein is probably one of the most important historians working in America today. Probably. And with that, why don't we get things started? Rick, a few opening words.
Yes, thanks, John. So, just by a show of hands, who was at the talk last night, and who watched the debate last night? So, who did neither? You win the prize. No, I'm just kidding. Great. I just wanted to get a sense of where we're at. So in my talk last night, I mentioned that history is what happens when we're making other plans. That I had spent the last 17 years of my life figuring out and expressing how conservatism has come to dominate American political culture in a way that never would have been expected when I began my story, which was in 1958. Not my own work in 1958. I was born in 1969, but the narrative that I'm telling, in which basically once Dwight D. Eisenhower kind of accepted and even expanded certain aspects of the New Deal, conservatism was widely judged by every observer who was taken seriously as irrelevant to American political development. And how did it happen that 22 years later, Ronald Reagan wins this landslide re-election? And even if you guys remember in 1980, it wasn't just that Reagan won this landslide election, it was that all these conservative giants were kicked out of Congress and the Senate. The Birch Bayhs, the George McGoverns, the Frank Churches, and more. So that's the story I taken upon myself to explain, and the first volume covers those years from 1958 to 1964. And I would say that of the three volumes, 58 to 64, 65 to 72, and 73 to 76, and now working on 77 to 80. The first volume, kind of the main sort of theme and part of the story, is the beginnings of what we call a conservative infrastructure, the political institutions that were built through and with the movement to nominate Barry Goldwater for the Republican presidential candidacy and then to elect him. So you get figures like Richard Viguerie, who would later go on to become the pioneering promoter of political direct mail through the 70s and 80s. You have groups like Young Americans for Freedom. You have institutions like National Review. You have the people who would go on to found the Heritage Foundation. All these people get their start in this attempt to kind of dethrone the moderates and liberals in the Republican Party. And the second volume, Nixonland, which covers the years from 1965, kind of starting with the Watts riots, only a few days after Lyndon Johnson passes the Voting Rights Act and declares basically America's racial problems to have been transcended, and goes to 1972 and Nixon's triumphant re-election. I would say the main focus of that is Richard Nixon's contribution to kind of the psychological appeal of conservatism to middle America. And this, of course, is sort of the politics of resentment against cosmopolitan liberals who are always looking down their noses at the ordinary folks who are working hard and playing by the rules, expressed most eloquently and effectively and dramatically in this famous silent majority speech. The silent majority of the people who don't protest, who are patriots, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Those liberal swells who think that they're more moral than you are kind of not quite as American as we are. And of course, that endures in spades in a figure like Sarah Palin, in basically all of the Republican candidates last night, whenever they talk about the liberal media, et cetera, et cetera. I think we all kind of get that. And then this most recent volume, which is entitled The Invisible Bridge, The Fall of Nixon and the Rise of Reagan, which came out in August of 2014 and just recently was re-released in paperback, adds a figure who's, in all the other books, just as Nixon is in all the books, but stirs in the Ronald Reagan part of the stew. And his contribution is this rhetoric of innocence, that America is this providential nation, that liberals and Democrats are negative, sour, don't understand the providential role of the city on the hill that God bequeathed to the world. And you see that also in spades these days. You see it, for example, in a set piece I put in my preface of Ambassador Samantha Power, the distinguished Harvard professor and scholar of genocide, who was nominated by President Obama to be his representative in the United Nations. And she'd written an article 10 years before in the New Republic arguing that America in its history had things to answer for, that we'd backed dictators, all the history that we're familiar with. Jimmy Carter put it in a famous speech in Notre Dame in May of 1977, his famous human rights speech, that in our inordinate fear of communism, we embraced any dictator that joined us in that fear. So she kind of extended that discourse in a way that I think a lot of us would be comfortable with. But Marco Rubio, sitting in the judgment seat in the Senate, said, you said America has a lot to apologize for. What precisely do you believe America has to apologize for? And Samantha Power, in order to survive in this new political climate that Ronald Reagan bequeathed us, said, America is the greatest nation in the history of the world and has nothing to apologize for. Barack Obama said much the same thing in his convention speech in 2012. Mitt Romney, of course, said it all the time. Now it's impossible to imagine our political set piece without that. So we have these kind of three things, and they kind of like roll into each other like waves, and you kind of add them all together, and you have basically, with lots of personalities and contingencies that and missteps by liberals and the Democrats and all the rest, you have basically, in my judgment, a pretty good portrait of the world we live in now, until so my experience reading pretty much all coverage of Republican candidates and is kind of like, I understand it all. I can usually kind of anticipate. A lot of people talk about sort of the Tea Party as if it were this very new phenomenon, but I can kind of trace it back to conservative gestures going back to the 50s. So my typical speech was to pick up 3 or 4 things from the news that are going on and trace them back through this history that I've written. And I had a very, just to give the kind of the backstory of my address last night, I had a very dark night of the soul one day when I was reading Evan Osnos's recent piece on Donald Trump in the New Yorker and his connection to white supremacists, and suddenly kind of had to look up with a start and say, I don't understand this. This doesn't quite fit into this paradigm that I've laid out for myself and for my readers. So that's why I began my address last night by saying history is what happens when you're making other plans. And I went forward, and it'll be published for those of you who weren't able to be there. And my current outlet, the Washington Spectator, their website, I explained the ways in which the Donald Trump phenomenon veers from this story I've been telling. And since delivering that in conversation with my friends David Farber and Beth Bailey, who are new history professors here, have kind of refined it, some of the things in my own mind. And then one more element that is a product of all my work on both as a political journalist and as a political historian, which fortunately the Trump phenomenon hasn't changed, is the inadequacy, shall we say, of the paradigm by which the political media understand our politics. So that was a bit of the story last night too. So that's where we are, and luckily I'm in a sort of a bit of a intellectual ferment between my ears right now. So the kind of conversation we'll have today will probably contribute profoundly to my own attempts to understand what we're up to. So at that, let's open things up.
Yeah, we do want to take questions. There are a couple of mics going around. While we're waiting for mics to get into people's hands, I'm going to start with the first question. One of the things you mentioned last night, and was actually maybe most compelling to me, is you started to account for the strange absence of a particularly powerful analytical term in contemporary American thought, one that used to be used quite regularly, used to have some descriptive value, fascist.
The F word.
The F word, right? That Donald Trump has many of the hallmarks of what 50 years ago could be easily identified as a fascist. But that we don't use that term anymore. It's not a kind of idea we use anymore. I wonder if you wouldn't mind just giving us your sense of why you think that concept, that idea, has essentially died or been evacuated.
Is anyone here familiar? I think you probably are, John. As a netizen of the idea Godwin's law. John?
What is it? It does ring a bell for sure.
The first person to bring up Hitler in an argument loses. Right. Well, like in the period in which, of my first book before the storm, everyone would have lost.
Yeah.
Because, for the generation for whom World War II was a living memory, it kind of clouded every political discussion. So when a guy like Barry Goldwater or the John Birch Society came along, I have a quote from Partisan Review, the sort of marquee political journal of the time, in which Philip Rov, who was one of the editors, said that the Goldwater phenomenon represents a recrudescence on American soil of the politics that of Europe that ended with millions dead. This is obviously referring to fascism and Nazism. And the thing that's striking about that is Partisan Review, within kind of 10, 15 years, had become a neoconservative magazine and shared most of Goldwater's ideologies. So there was a kind of interpretive bluntness there, which exacerbated by the fact that both left and right were throwing the term at each other so frequently by the end of the 60s. I mean, Reagan loved to compare student protesters who, after all, were, through violence or the threat of violence, keeping kids from going to classes at places like the University of Kansas. He would call them fascists. This is what we fought against in World War II. And that was salient to a lot of people. And then, of course, once Reagan, orders a Sikorsky helicopter to fly over Sproul Plaza in Berkeley in 1969 during the People's Park protests and dump tear gas, well, he's a fascist too. Radicals were calling liberals fascists, et cetera, et cetera. So it lost its usefulness except as an epithet. But what was lost to us was a certain way of thinking about mass psychology, individual psychology, about social alienation. There was a very fascinating piece which I recommend everyone look up called "An American Void" on Dylan Roof, the guy who assassinated 9 people in the church in South Carolina, and what his life was like in this trailer, with no hope, no meaning, and if someone read about him in the 1950s, a sociologist, say, or a political scientist, they would say, this guy is the raw material for you kind of take an alienated mass of people who are uprooted from any kind of traditional patterns of meaning, and you take a venal, alienated politician who is addicted to power, and you put them together, and the next thing you know, you have people goose-stepping down the street. What that doesn't explain is, whether it's conceivable that, America could become a one-party state, right? Which is, I don't think, something any of us would disagree. So my kind of project last night was to kind of rescue what was useful in the fascism paradigm and what deserves to be thrown away. And what I discovered in the process of the past week of just putting this together in a very kind of raw state was, well, it certainly helps explain something that people consider a mystery, which is why Trump is so popular, and why he's able to get away with certain kind of heresies when it comes to what seem to be kind of settled policy consensus within the Republican Party. This is the guy who says maybe we should raise taxes on the highest earners. This is a guy who says, well, maybe single payer healthcare is not such a bad idea. This is a guy who entertained being pro-choice, and that seems really strange to us now. The guy considered the kind of furthest right-wing, most demagogic, most immigrant-hating Republican candidate would entertain these quote-unquote liberal notions. Well, there's an idea within the history of thinking about fascism of Herrenvolk democracy, which is basically like democracy for the dominant white population and disenfranchisement for minorities. And that's not liberal. That's actually more authoritarian, because it basically exasperates the sense that there's an in-group and an out-group. It heaps scapegoating upon scapegoating, and it's very popular. It's populist. I mean, this is how George Wallace governed Alabama. This is how Verhold governed South Africa. And I knew from my research, and I'll be writing about it in my current book, that a lot of what the Republicans propose economically just doesn't poll very well. It's not very popular. I mean, when like Pew has been polling on whether people want taxes on rich people to be raised forever, and it's always 60%, 65%. And there's this history of activists within the New Right in the 70s saying, well, we need to figure out a way to do the stuff that we really want to do, which is, break unions and weaken the federal government, even though it's not necessarily popular. And one of those New Right leaders is a guy named Paul Weyrich, who founded the Heritage Foundation, among other groups, and he said, well, sex is the Achilles heel of the liberal Democrats. So they did things like what we're very familiar with, went after gay rights, went after the Equal Rights Amendment, and used that grant of power. For example, George Bush wins in 2004 partially because there's lots of gay marriage initiatives on the ballots, anti-gay marriage initiatives. And the next day he says, well, I have my mandate. I'm privatizing Social Security. So Donald Trump doesn't say anything about privatizing Social Security. Fair and folk democracy.
Yeah, yeah, a powerful concept. So we have a question over here, and yeah, we have one over here.
I have a question about the application of your work to conservative diplomacy, and it's particularly prompted. I was in the stay-at-home and watched the debate camp. There was a moment last night in which one of the CNN people asked a question about talking to Putin. Fiorina hopped in first and said, under no circumstances, I would not spend 1 minute. And then Trump, two over from her, said, sure, I make deals. I talk to everybody.
Right.
Where does this fit in your tradition?
Well, I mean, Trump is kind of sui generis in a lot of ways. I mean, it's this idea that he can go in a room and, I mean, the funniest moment was, the purest aura of Trumpism that was mined last night was when George Bush thought he completely would paint Donald Trump in a corner by saying, well, you say that all of us are bought off, but the only time I was ever bribed by someone was you when you wanted to have gambling in Florida. And Trump, whether he was telling the truth or not, he lies a lot, said, well, gee, Governor, basically if I bribed you, you would have stayed bribed. He said, I would have won. We'd have had gambling in Florida. This idea that he can kind of prevail in any kind of mano-a-mano confrontation. But the tradition of despising the idea of talking to enemies in diplomacy really is kind of a function of the good versus evil, black and white, Manichaean thinking. Not the idea that the world is a mess of compromises, but good guys are good guys and bad guys are bad guys, and devil take the hindmost. The only thing that can stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. Well, you're a good guy with a gun until you decide to shoot your mother-in-law, So the idea that sort of you can sort out populations and nations into these kind of walls in which one side falls on one side and one falls on the other is very, very familiar to kind of the conservative routines of thought. And, this diplomacy, doesn't work that way. You don't get cooties from talking to a Raul Castro. You don't get cooties from talking even to a Kim Jong-un. You just kind of see what their position is. Why they're doing what they do. And it's a game of wits, and diplomacy is diplomacy, and it's a very complex game. It's also a game that works much better when you're out of power than when you're in power, because you can kind of afford the martial barks of a demagogue because you don't have to govern anything. It's kind of consequence free. So you can have a Joe McCarthy speaking to the Democratic diplomats like Dean Acheson and saying, you lost China. How did you do that? You must have intended it or something. Conspiracy so immense to dwarf any in the history of mankind. So I think that the biggest difference with Trump is I think he imagines himself as a wielder of power a lot more than sort of like a sort of speaking in ideal types. I mean, and of course there's a tradition of the conservative hero Ronald Reagan, sitting down with Gorbachev, and when that happened, people like George Will talked about him like a commie simp sellout. If you look back at what conservative activists were saying about Ronald Reagan during his term, he was always on the verge of selling himself out to the liberals. But a worshiper of power will say, well, Reagan was great because he's Reagan.
Yeah. Another.
Let me just be slightly contrarian, if I could, and say that I'm not entirely convinced that Trump is so far outside the paradigm that
Me
you-
neither.
you've
So
sketched over the years. Okay. But as I sat here, I was just thinking, I'm sure Trump is very optimistic for the American future, which is part of your paradigm. I'm sure he would make no apology for American actions around the world, which is part of your paradigm. I'm sure he believes in US exceptionalism, that there is the city on the hill, etc., which is part of your paradigm. And I doubt he's a great fan of big government or of state government, with the possible exception of the healthcare issue that you mentioned. The only area, therefore, I can feel convinced by him being outside your paradigm is the area of economic policy and economic ideas that you mentioned, and possibly also the determination to negotiate rather than invade, which the neocons did quite so readily. So there are so many issues, I think, in which he's very much within your paradigm as far as I can see. But
well, let me hit three of those things. First of all, is the issue. Let's talk about the issue of kind of like whether he's for government or big government or not. Of course, his dad, Fred Trump, made his fortune basically building kind of quasi-public housing for sort of lower middle class families in the outer boroughs. And Trump basically used a lot of the tricks that his dad used, as only across the river with kind of luxury buildings. And a big part of their modus operandi was leveraging lots of different kinds of government programs. I mean, Trump Tower was built with tax abatements that were intended for low-income housing. So I think he sees kind of government. I think he's kind of agnostic about government. He doesn't have that kind of pure ideological hatred of government. He sees it as kind of part of the game, part of like the tools you use in a deal, part of what you leverage, the 1990 Trump documentary that I mentioned last night, which is you can all watch and which is fascinating online, is kind of makes that pretty clear. As far as he thinks that America is a great nation, I think what's really kind of striking, and the other Republican candidates have to no avail been using that, and they're kind of trying to take him down a peg, is his Spenglerian gloom about America's prospects. We're getting beaten by everybody. China. Our leaders are so dumb. And this is kind of a subtle thing. Jimmy Carter, George McGovern expressed his admiration for Jimmy Carter. In Jimmy Carter's formulation, we need a government as good as its people, right? So separating kind of the American nation, the essential America that's noble, and the government, which is kind of corrupt and gross, right? Whereas when George McGovern tried to criticize America in 1972, he made it sound like he was attacking the country itself. It's not as if Ronald Reagan didn't say things were wrong with America. He just kind of blamed it all on this kind of force that he constructed as alien, which was kind of liberalism. Donald Trump is relentlessly negative. He's not saying anything good about anyone. David Brooks, in one of the very few formulations by him that I consider intelligent, said that Donald Trump divides the world into two categories: the stupid and himself. I don't think he. I think he speaks of America as great and outstanding, but in the same way he talks about his, stakes as kind of great and outstanding. I just don't think he thinks about things in the same way. And kind of within the kind of the fascist tradition, the idea of the nation is something that it's so compromised that it requires a rebirth in fire, this radical renewal, to return to this misty past and towards this transcendent future as against the rubble of the present. I don't quite recognize that in the conservative movement. A lot of these things are differences of tone, differences of emphasis, but National Review just despises the guy. Jonah Goldberg, the liberal fascism guy, has just completely made his raison d'etre calling out Donald Trump for his sins against conservative orthodoxy. So there's that.
All right, don't make me start calling on people.
How about one of the younger folks? I'm glad to see you here.
Hi, so we've talked a lot about Trump. I was wondering how you feel about some of the other candidates, although there are quite a few. I wasn't able to watch the debate because I was at the lecture, but there were a lot of people on Twitter calling for Carly Fiorina as the winner of last night's debate.
I think that in the first debate, I was telling David Farber, if you kind of ignore the actual intellectual content of what they were saying, in the first debate, I thought the guy who seemed most kind of presidential was Ben Carson. Kind of calm, self-contained, confident. And I kind of felt that way, yes, about Carly Fiorina. She was able to kind of pivot off the insult from Donald Trump. And since the dynamic of the race has become getting down in the gutter with Donald Trump and kind of getting into his adolescent kind of bitch slap fights, with Bobby Jindal saying he looks like he has a raccoon on his head and all this stuff. Carly Fiorina chose a very, I think, wise rhetorical strategy when she was directly asked about the insult against her. Donald Trump, of course, said, "Would you vote for someone with that face?" And then claimed he was talking about her persona. She said, "I think that the women of America knew exactly what you were referring to." So she used one of the very clever tricks politicians do in not repeating the charge, right, which kind of insinuates it's inside people's head. She kind of leveraged a kind of maternal, wise, kind of even if you will, grandmotherly confidence, which is how she's trying to kind of frame her appeal. She does what Hillary Clinton does, only better. And she, I think, came off on TV as a mother amongst a bunch of bickering little boys. So yes, in my little pundit hat, which I hate, I think yes, she ran away with it. From what little I saw last night, it was 3 hours long.
Yeah, it was long.
A 3-hour cruise.
A war of attrition it's turning into. Please, over here. Wait for the mic if you wouldn't mind.
In our two-party system, we have found people on both sides of the aisle forced to move to the extreme or to the middle in order to get elected.
Mm-hmm.
Especially with conservatives, there was a large group who just checked out of the election.
Yeah.
The presidential election last time. Have you done any research to determine the extent of that and why?
Well,
it seems to me it'd be better to vote for the person closer to how you feel than to leave it alone.
Let me address a question to you, actually. So you mentioned, both Democrats and Republicans have had to kind of tend towards the extremes to get noticed and taken seriously. What Democrat and what extreme position do you see a Democrat taking as opposed to a Republican? Because I don't see any. I see the Democratic Party as pretty much a party of the center these days. Right. The people who are at the core of the Republican coalition, present company accepted, older white folks, have proven to have very high rates of participation compared to younger people, compared to people of color, compared to younger educated professionals. And that's why last night I talked about our two electorates. The electorate that votes in presidential elections, which is basically a demographic cross-section of the country. And when lots of people vote, Democrats tend to win. That's why you see so many efforts to kind of limit the franchise among Republicans. But in those off-year elections, the 2010s, the 1994s, when Newt Gingrich's guys won, the electorate is more those motivated ideological voters. And older folks who've kind of gotten the civic habit of going to the polls partially and have learned kind of to activate themselves politically in part over issues like Social Security, are just, you know, they're just much more likely to turn out. And also Republicans, since they become a more movement ideological party, have become quite skilled and aggressive at making these off-year elections quite ideological and trying to frame them around issues that turn out these kind of quote-unquote base voters, these ideological, loaded for bear voters. So, 2010, it's all these issues about, Barack Obama stealing our liberty. They'll do things like put initiatives on the ballot on hot-button issues. Democrats have been much more reluctant to do that because, like I say, the people who are running the Democratic Party in Washington much more kind of see themselves as a party of the center. Republicans kind of feed off their base. Democratic leaders often have contempt for their base. One of Barack Obama's spokesmen dismissed what he called the professional left, in a press conference. You would never see a spokesperson for a conservative politician speak to their base in such condescending terms. So you see things like Bill Clinton. One of the first big projects he had was NAFTA, which he passed, but at the expense of the enthusiasm of the union members that make such a big part of his base. Barack Obama didn't say to himself, wow, well, I really have to do something to get liberals excited for the 2010 off-year election. It just tends not to be how Washington Democrats think. So you don't see Republican voters turned off by sort of impassioned extremism from their leaders. You see them kind of energized by it. They say there's not enough. Eric Cantor's a sellout, so we're going to vote for this other guy, Brat. Whereas Democratic voters tend to be a lot more turned off by what they see as kind of extremism. So you have this very fascinating movement in 2010, I think it was, where Republicans are all rushing to the polls to defeat the socialist Barack Obama, and highly educated, culturally sophisticated, cosmopolitan liberals like my fiance rushed to Washington, D.C. the weekend before the election to attend Stephen Colbert and Jon Stewart's rally attacking both sides for being too stupid and silly and extreme, when they should have been knocking on doors and saying, we got to defeat these Tea Party candidates.
Back in the back corner there.
Are you next? Okay. So you've written quite astutely about the rise of conservatism in the United States, but of course, those of us who do history for a living know that that's a global phenomenon, especially in Western Europe. And so I'm wondering, with the choice of the Labour Party of Jeremy Corbyn last week, how you kind of see this story in a broader context, and what you think of the global left.
Right. So, as far as the global left, what we saw in England last week, and also in places like Spain and in places like Greece, is a reaction against kind of third way centrism, right? Austerity. Let's call it austerity liberalism, right? To coin a phrase, which really resembles what Clinton called triangulation, right? I mean, you frame yourself as the center between the left of your own party and the Conservative Party. Now, on the other side, we have within Britain the tradition of Thatcherite conservatism, which they all worship Thatcher. I think someone last night, they were supposed to say, which woman do you want in the $10 bill? And someone said Margaret Thatcher. And they also said Rosa Parks, who actually had a flirtation with the Communist Party and was on the board of Planned Parenthood. So that was kind of interesting. So the Thatcherite right, kind of is similar to our kind of movement conservatism. Economically neoliberal, socially conservative, union busting, contemptuous of kind of special claims by minorities. But then we have this other factor in Europe, which is also doing quite well, and this is more of this kind of Herrenvolk democracy kind of right. This is more the right that's kind of descended from the fascist strain. This is the Le Pens. This is the leader in Hungary who's, putting up barbed wire and kicking people off trains. And I don't know his name and I don't know a lot about him, but I participated in a forum on prospects for democracy in the policy magazine Boston Review, responding to an essay by the distinguished political scientist Ira Katz-Nelson, and he basically explained this Hungarian leader as pretty much a fascist. Do you know anything about him?
This has been going on for a few years now. They have been sort of
Yes.
sliding farther and farther to the far right for about 4 or 5 years now in Hungary.
So yes, so around the issue of immigration and the changing complexion of these societies and now refugees, you do see a resurgent right, which is not Thatcherite, which is not conservative in the American grain, in that you don't see these parties saying we need to cut, unemployment insurance. We have 6 weeks of paid vacation in Sweden, and we need 2 weeks. Right? You're not going to see a far right candidate in Sweden say that. You're not going to see the Le Pens saying, we really need to placate the bond markets, right? Because there's this kind of anti-finance capitalism tradition, which, bears a family resemblance to anti-Semitism, right? Jewish bankers. So, Trump may well represent more of an international phenomenon. I'm not sure he knows that. He's kind of responding to forces that he doesn't quite have, he's not able to articulate in that way. But that seems to be kind of the map of global politics that way. Now, in a sense, it's kind of interesting because the forces of austerity seem to be outnumbered 2 to 1, right? But the forces of austerity have an ace in the hole, in that kind of they are the party of finance capital, and can kind of play the we're not ideological, we just need to be governed by technocrat crowd, which basically is what's been happening in Greece. And it's a very exciting time. And we were really kind of like at a switching point in which, is Ireland a success because of austerity? Right. Or is their economic growth a function of the social dispossession of a lot of the population? Even something like the Scottish independence vote, the hidden issue in that was the people who were calling for Scottish independence were saying, we want to keep free college in Scotland. They were largely for preserving the social democracy. Bernie Sanders, right, is largely the anti-austerity against the kind of Clinton triangulation bit, and then Corbyn, of course, represents the same phenomenon.
Do you see him as a last gasp, or do you see him as the resurgence? I mean, I was struck by the image of Corbyn singing the red flag, and this sort of idea of kind of this new left, and I couldn't figure out whether I thought it was a symbol of a kind of left that's trying to remind people that it's important, but really is dead, or the bandwagon of something new.
Yeah. One more point before I address that. In my own state of Illinois, we have an austerity shock doctrine Republican, Governor Rauner, who is be able to enjoy a discourse in the press of, wow, Illinois is gridlocked between the Democrats and the Republicans, whereas I think it's much more of a case that he's deliberately crashing the government so he can, wipe a lot of these social programs off the books by not having a budget, which is what's happening. And we'll see what kind of anti-austerity left we're able to muster in Illinois and Chicago against that. But the question of so whether kind of, let's say, the anti-austerity social democratic left is the last gasp of a dying tradition, or the exciting dawn of something new. Well, I mean, I think that social democracy itself is an exciting kind of vibrant way to run a society, and creates a lot of social energy. And the fact that West Germany, Germany is a better place to be an entrepreneur than America, because they have the kind of social provisions that let people take risks in their lives. So a lot of things that people, kind of cliches about social democracy, that it, creates these big bureaucracies and destroys freedom. I think that's ideological propaganda from the forces of anti-austerity. So I think there's a lot of dynamism built into social democracy. In the case of Bernie Sanders, who I've done a lot of reporting on and have a big article coming out about, the hidden reason he's surging is because, as I mentioned last night, young people are coming out for him in droves. It's not old hippies, When I went to the big rally of 6,000 people in downtown Dallas, the old hippies I talked to were like, I can't believe it. And I've seen none of these people at any political events. They're all in their 20s, and they're all giving him standing ovations when he says he wants to make college free, because people are so hobbled by debt, and it's such a kind of drain on our creativity. It's a drain on our dynamism. So I guess my answer would be that the Democratic left's resurgence may well represent the leading edge of something that's quite dynamic. Professor.
I wonder if I could ask you to...
Corbyn's kind of a weirdo, isn't he?
Who?
Corbyn.
He's unusual. Yeah. But I think he might surprise us, actually, but we'll see. I wanted you to put alongside, or put together, your work over the last 15 years with the political developments of the century we're in. The story you tell in those 3 volumes has this very nice sort of symmetry of ever upwards, ever ascending conservative revival, and then the moment of triumph with Reagan's election in 1980. So it's a very nice rounded story. It's a success story in a way. The conservative movement is really back in business. I just wondered how that sits with the last few years and what might be the next few years. Because apart from the period 2000-2008, you could actually have the Democrats in the White House from 2008 all the way through to 2020 if Clinton does indeed win in 16. That's a heck of a long time to have the White House for the Democrats.
Right.
I just wondered how this sort of triumphant conservative movement fits with that Democratic ascendancy, if anything.
Well, one of the things I point out in the preface to Before the Storm is, I say, well, Goldwater lost, conservatism was dismissed as irrelevant to America's future, then Reagan wins, and then in 1992, Bill Clinton wins with a lot of the same ideas that Barry Goldwater had. Ending welfare as we know it, things like that. So I still think that the objective center, if we could locate such a thing, continues to move to the right. In the Obama administration, of course, we have, an attorney general who declined to prosecute criminals because they happen to own banks. We have a figure like Cass Sunstein, who's basically a Chicago school neoliberal, running an office begun by Ronald Reagan, OIRA, the office of basically Reagan started this to kind of have an independent review of every regulation proposed in all of the federal government. And basically it was a bottleneck for any regulation, whether it was an environmental regulation or a food safety regulation. and Obama placed in this very obscure office, which has an enormous amount of power, this figure, Kat Sunstein, who drove kind of the consumer movement absolutely nuts by kind of bottlenecking regulations for things like, arsenic and food safety. It institutionalized that. I think we have the success of kind of guerrilla war on several issues at the local level, such that it's virtually impossible to get an abortion in most of the country. We have the veritable enshrinement of balanced budgets as the alpha and the omega of wise social policy. And the final death of the core Keynesian insight that the government is the primer of the pump in the case of a weak economy. Of course, we have the tragic setbacks for race relations. I think, Obama is a complicated character, and he has a complicated record of successes and failures, and feints to the right and feints to the left. But I think fundamentally, he was not a vehicle for moving the center of gravity in the country particularly far to the left, partially because I don't think he was an effective warrior against the onrushing right-wing hegemony, which, of course, in his bones, he wishes to accommodate, instead of standing athwart history and yelling "stop," to quote what William F. Buckley said was National Review's job in 1955. But these propositions are all arguable. Yes.
About how this conservative resurgence that you've spoken about, now long-lasting, plays out on university campuses.
That's such an interesting question. I don't know about at Kansas, but in a lot of campuses, there's this sort of intense battle going on about issues like free speech and psychic comfort of undergraduates who supposedly don't want to hear anything that might offend them, and are backlashing against professors because of what they call microaggressions. I have no idea whether there have been any kind of marquee public fights over issues like that here. Have there been?
Not many, no.
Yeah.
We did have, beginning of last year, quite a bit of concern about sexual assault on campus. And that has been an ongoing issue. But actually the university has been, I think, quite open to public discussion and not the kind of political attacks.
And I mean, when it comes to sexual assault, there have been very impassioned arguments about due process for young men whose cases are adjudicated within the administrative bubble of the university, as against the court system, where, of course, they get to meet their accuser and do all those things that the Constitution guarantees. One of the interesting things about universities to me is to look at the big political picture. One of the things that makes the conservative movement so successful is that they think in very broad, long-term, institutional, strategic terms. So they locate various institutional centers of what they would consider liberal power. The media, mainline churches like Unitarians and Methodists and things like that. The United Church of Christ. Think of Obama's Reverend Wright. And universities and public television, public media, NPR, and they say, how can we degrade the capacity of these institutions to advance what we consider a liberal agenda. They do it quite systematically. Nixon did it with the networks by threatening their licenses. The attack on political correctness in the universities, and the way rich donors are kind of endowing their own conservative research centers on campuses like Princeton, where they have the Madison Center, which is literally, they call it part of Princeton, but they get to hire and fire on their own, right? The churches, one of the pioneering things in the late 70s, the New Right basically took over the Southern Baptists, which had very liberal positions on abortion before that. They go down the list. Liberals don't do that, right? We don't say, here are some conservative institutions, the military, the churches, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the things that frustrates me about Obama, he doesn't think about these kind of institutional structural issues of how can he leave liberalism stronger than he found it. And an example I like to say is, when I go to a campus like this, in the middle of a state like Kansas, everyone is liberal. But they don't see themselves, and the institutions don't see themselves as advancing a liberal political agenda. They see themselves as neutral or just natural. And the White House doesn't say, how can we better mobilize college campuses and college towns to leave liberalism stronger than we found it, institutionally speaking? How can we turn mainline non-evangelical Protestant churches into better vessels for liberalism? And one of the reasons they don't do this is because liberals are proceduralists. We believe in the rules, and the rules are these are nonprofit, tax-deductible organizations, whereas conservatives love to just really skirt the edge of the rules and go over. I mean, in 1980, Christian Voice pioneered the scorecard, the legislative scorecard, basically saying, here's the checklist. It's just kind of like getting around the rules that allow these churches to keep their tax deductions while basically functioning as partisan political clubhouses. They would say, in Idaho, say there's a Senate race. Here's 10 issues Christians can be concerned about. Do the two candidates in the Senate race, Steve Sims, who was a John Birch Society member, or Frank Church, the incumbent, the liberal incumbent, what do they say about abortion? Are they, in one column, for the murder of babies? Or in the other column, against the murder of babies? Well, we're not saying who to vote for. We're just creating this informational checklist. We don't have kind of creative minds within the Liberal Coalition saying, wow, how can we make sure that 90% of the liberals who live in Lawrence, Kansas show up to vote when Brownback comes up for re-election? That wouldn't be fair.
Do we have time for one more? I think so.
We figured it all out.
I think so.
No,
we're
we got
close.
the gentleman
We're
with the
close.
bread.
We're right there.
I read your two books and just got the other one last night. I've been trying to figure out what the hell's gone on with our country since I grew up in the late 40s and early 50s. And there's so much, it's hard to figure it out, but I'm a 40-year Teamster truck driver.
Thank you for your service.
Well, thank you. I lost my last Teamster job when the economy tanked. And we were sitting in the break room, and all the guys were bitching about Obama and his stimulus program.
Yeah.
And
The
I said,
stimulus
"Wait."
program.
Yeah, the stimulus program. And I said,
And the one where truck drivers
If
ride all
you-
over the place and deliver construction equipment?
Have you looked at that big orange sign that's on the edge of the project? That we had two of them redoing big cloverleaf intersections. I said if it wasn't for the stimulus plan, none of us would be working. And as a matter of fact, because of the decline in our business, half of our list, including me, are no longer Teamsters. I mean, I'm a retired Teamster now.
Right.
But it seems to me that Nixon was so cynical in the way he would use, well, in those days, the communism argument to undermine. It had nothing to do with the topic.
The hard hats.
Yes, exactly. And the two Democratic presidents we've had since Johnson were both from southern right-to-work states.
Right, not big union guys.
Not big union guys.
Yeah.
And now we have Obama, who's been swimming against this headwind of racism. And nothing was done to help people who lost their houses, including me.
Yeah.
But they threw all this money at the banks.
Yeah.
And I'm still trying to figure out what the hell is going on. But I think some of our prejudices are being used against us and are leading us down the line. I was at a seminar, a panel discussion about what happened in Wisconsin.
Yeah.
And it
I'm a
turned
native
out that one of the
Wisconsinite.
guys who was a union official up in Oshkosh or someplace like that said, well, one thing that happened is 800,000 Democrats didn't vote. And had it not been for that, Walker never would have been governor.
Yeah. Let me say.
I'm kind of wandering here, but I'm trying to figure out what the hell's going on.
You've teed up the ball nicely. So let me conclude then with two thoughts. First of all, the circular firing squad of the failures of Democrats and liberals and the left and unions. I mean, for God's sake, the Teamsters. I mean, they endorsed Richard Nixon, and did so much to, basically feed into the right-wing narrative of unions as special interests, just out for, not even out for the power of their own members, out for the power of their own leaders, right? I mean, I don't need to dwell on that. I'm sure it's been a heartbreak for you. And there have been, of course, heroic Teamsters who've, fought bravely against that. But the other point I want to make is there's a new documentary that's going to be coming out quite soon, hopefully at the Sundance Film Festival, called The Brainwashing of My Father. And I'm one of the talking heads in it. And it's by a woman, a documentarian, who took on the project of figuring out how her father changed from a sweet, generous, kind-hearted man to a bitter, terrified reactionary. And it's quite skilled at showing the effect of right-wing media, talk radio and Fox News, on sort of the consciousness of millions of Americans, a lot of them, of course, working class. And the most striking thing in the movie is once she kind of put out the call for, are there people who had this experience with their parents, she received volumes and volumes and volumes of videotape testimonies. She kind of one will show on the screen and then the screen will pull back and it'll be literally hundreds of people saying the same thing and saying, my father, in the case of her father, got a job where he suddenly had to drive 45 minutes every day and started listening to right-wing talk radio. And all these people saying, again, I can't recognize him anymore. He won't listen to reason. He's just so afraid all the time. It's literally kind of rewiring people's brains. And a lot of us, don't want to kind of pay attention to this. And it's really striking that, I knew something was going on with Trump and that he wasn't your garden variety Republican when he threw Fox News under the bus. But the fact of the matter is, this is a very powerful way of not just kind of intervening in kind of the electoral process, but the consciousness of millions of Americans, such that people can't even see the nose in the case of the stimulus in front of their face. And of course, this never would have happened had Ronald Reagan not made this policy intervention of getting rid of the fairness doctrine, where you used to be able to claim free airtime if you made a partisan statement. That's a big part of the story, and I don't even think kind of people who write political theory have kind of figured out how to kind of integrate that into their work. So that's kind of our next frontier for us, I think.
Yeah, I think so. I think with that, we'll bring this to a close.
That happy note.
Would you all join me in a quick round of applause for Mr. Perlstein?